Hey guys, I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and for the past 2 weeks I've been living with the Apple AirPods Max, which I'm sure you've heard of by now, 550 bucks, yada yada yada. But, well, if you're new to this channel, what I typically do is I typically review audio gear. I review a lot of headphones. In fact, over here to my left, I've got about 100 different pairs of headphones and earphones, so you could say that I know what good audio sounds like, and if I'm perfectly honest with you, Bluetooth noise canceling headphones have not really been good quality audio. So I was really interested to find out, are the Apple AirPods Max better than the Sony XM3s and the Bose 700s and everything else that I've heard? And I've kind of already answered that question, just not to bury the lead. I think this is a much better sounding headphone than those, but we'll talk a little bit more about sound. I'm gonna warn you ahead of time, this is gonna be probably a little bit of a long review. I've got quite a few different things to talk about with this headphone. I'm gonna get into more detail about that sound, but I also wanna talk about the build, the physical aspects of the AirPods Max, comfort, stuff like that, as well as talk about some sort of functional day-to-day life things that I haven't heard other people talking about that I think are worth knowing. So that's what we're gonna talk about in this review, and if you're watching now live, this is in fact a live stream. You're in the chat, I see you there. We're gonna have a little conversation at the end of this video. If you're not watching live, you missed out on the chat, but that's okay. You can go ahead and subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and then next time I go live, YouTube will let you know. And then we can have a little conversation like I'll have with the other folks. But for everybody else, let's go ahead and dig into the Apple AirPods Max. All right, so this is the headphone. And I'm gonna cut to the chase pretty quickly, or I'll try and be quick as possible. Let's talk about the build, all right? The physical aspects of it. And I think generally this is a very, very well-built headphone. In fact, you know, it's 550 bucks, so it's expensive by non-audiophile standards, but I can't really think of any headphone that I have, and I've got some headphones that are fairly expensive, at least by, you know, again, other people's, normal people's standards. I can't think of any other headphone that I've got that is built as well as the AirPods Max. It's just everything on here, right? You've got these aluminum cups, which that is a massive amount of aluminum here. You've got these stainless steel arms with these well-oiled connectors that just, they've got like the perfect amount of stiffness, holds their place. And that might not seem important to you, but I gotta say, I'm pretty impressed with the build generally here of the AirPods Max. Now, there were a couple of things I wasn't sure about, like this headband, and frankly, I think I do like this headband, although the material on it seems like it could be one of the weak points. It's just kind of a thin mesh, and I don't know. Long-term wise, that seems like a sort of thing that could catch. You could get like a snag and pull on that, and perhaps cause some damage, and it does not seem to be a thing that will be easily replaceable. So that's a thing to watch out for. And then maybe again, if I'm being picky, I think the material on these pads is actually a little bit funky. I don't know if you'll be able to tell here on the camera, but it's almost more like a nylon versus the typical pleather that you would get on most other headphones, frankly. So, I mean, it's not necessarily a bad material. It's just a little bit odd, and you can see, you can kind of hear the, one of the side effects is that it's a little bit scratchy sounding, and that you can kind of hear when you throw it on your head, which I'll go ahead and do right now. So turn on the transparency mode. So yeah, you can hear that pad just kind of rubbing up against your head, and maybe not the most pleasant, but for the most part, I'm pretty happy with the build of this headphone and also generally the comfort. I know a lot of people make a lot to do of the weight of the AirPods Max. It's like a 385 gram headphone, something like that, which is definitely heavier than your Bose and your Sonys by about 50%, which sounds like a lot. But in terms of like audiophile headphone land, these aren't actually that heavy. In fact, these things weigh just about the same as something like the Hyphen Sundara or the Philips Fidelio X2s, and I never had any complaints about the weight of those, and frankly, I don't have any complaints about the weight of the AirPods Max. If I had any complaints about these things in terms of comfort, well, let's see. I think that, you know, that material, that nylon material and this headband material, neither of them is very grippy, so sometimes it can feel like the headphone just doesn't have a great purchase on my head, right? If you've got like a silicone band that's gonna kind of grab your hair and stay in place, this doesn't do that. So maybe not the most secure feeling headphone. I wouldn't go running with it, but I probably wouldn't go running with any headphone. And then the other thing about the comfort that I'll talk about, can't see it there, flip this headphone around, there we can see it, is on the inside of these cups, there is this little hole for a sensor that detects, at least from what I understand, detects when these things are on your head. And I actually have an issue where when I put these things on my ears, the back of my ear, I can feel that sensor, and it's actually a little bit of an irritant. I do get used to it eventually, but it is a little bit of an irritant, and I thought worth calling out. Let's see, what other things can we talk about the build? I mean, I love the physical controls that you get here on the AirPods Max. Not just, I think they're pretty well done controls, but the fact that they're physical, I think, is a big deal. If you've used, something like the Sony XM3s or the Bose, they've got all tap controls, which are fairly well executed, but almost always I will prefer having physical buttons. And well, you get those here with the AirPods Max. You get this little digital crown, which doubles as both the volume control as well as what we could call just general playback controls, right? You single tap it to toggle play, pause, double tap to skip track forward, and triple tap to skip track back. And then you've got this one dedicated button to active noise canceling, and that will jump between active noise canceling on or transparency mode on. You can actually change that setting so that you could just go straight from active noise canceling on to active noise canceling off and bypass transparency mode if you want to. But I think the default configuration for that is actually pretty useful, and it makes it just a feature that, well, we'll get more into the functionality a little bit later, but it makes that transparency mode a feature that's just so much easier to use. Any other things I wanted to talk about? I mean, maybe one other minor complaint about the comfort of this is actually just how it is around the neck. Hopefully I'm not bumping up against the microphone there, but it's a little bit bulky. And you can fold it flat like this, but then it just kind of cuts into the neck. So generally I found the AirPods Max not the best around the neck wearing headphone, but I think because of that transparency mode being pretty good, maybe there's less reason to wear them that way, maybe. But yeah, let's go ahead and dive a little bit more into the functionality of the AirPods Max. And I think this is worth spending a little bit of time on, because I think that the reason that the big selling point for something like the AirPods Max is not just that it's a headphone that sounds decent. The big selling point for going with anything Apple, frankly, is that the user experience and the software integration and stuff is better than what you will get elsewhere. And I think that is the case here with AirPods Max, although I did run into a few issues. And so just for context, I did primarily, almost exclusively use this inside the Apple ecosystem. So here I've got a new M1 MacBook Air. Here I've got an iPhone 12 mini. So I've got these things fully updated in software. I've got the latest hardware. Any issues that I had, I don't think I can blame on not having the latest stuff. But generally, the ecosystem benefits that you get with something like the AirPods Max, right? Going to be, there's the simple pairing that you get with one device to another, or you get with sort of the initial setup. I don't put too much stock in that. But what is really nice is that once you pair this with, let's say, your phone, this thing is automatically paired with all of your other Apple devices, and it's, they've got some functionality that's supposed to intelligently move your audio source from laptop to iPhone to iPad, depending on what you're listening to. I gotta say, that stuff does not work that well. I know a lot of people talk about that in the reviews as a selling point, and it does work sometimes, but I find it, frankly, is not very consistent at all, and I would not consider that a selling point. However, what is still a selling point is that even if it doesn't automatically switch from one device to the next, it's at least easy enough to click a couple of buttons and have your audio routed from whichever device you want it to go to the AirPods Max. The other Apple stuff that you get is the auto pause on-off stuff. So when you're listening to music, you take the headphones off. The AirPods Max will automatically pause the music that's playing on your device, and then when you put the AirPods Max back on your head, they resume playing. So just like the AirPods Pro and the original AirPods, that works here. For some reason, it doesn't work on non-Apple devices. That seems like a thing that could work on non-Apple devices, but they decide not to do that. So there you go. And then there are some, minor software integrations. We talked about the pairing. There's some device settings that you can access on an iPhone that you can't access if you have these things paired to an Android phone. And then firmware updates, I think, kind of have to be done with this thing connected to an iPhone. I did connect the AirPods Max briefly to an Android phone, and I mean, sound-wise, it was fine. It connected pretty much any other Bluetooth headphone. The one caveat here is that Apple only supports AAC Bluetooth codec, while Android does support some higher bitrate codecs like aptX and LDAC. You're not going to get that here with the AirPods Max. That said, I didn't really have any issues with audio quality on my device using a Sony Xperia 10. The one big problem I did have with this thing on an Android device, and I'm surprised I haven't heard other people talking about this, maybe there's something I'm overlooking, but I couldn't get these things to disconnect from the Android device, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit, but the AirPods Max don't have a power button, right? So when I'm listening to this thing on my iPhone, I take them off my head, the AirPods know that they're off my head and they'll stop taking the audio from my iPod, my iPhone, and then I can use my iPhone without using these things, right? And I don't have to go into Bluetooth settings and manually disconnect them. On Android, it didn't do that. I would take these things off my head, put the AirPods on a table, and audio would still get routed to it. The only way that I could figure out how to get my Android device to stop sending audio to these, because there's no power button here, was to actually turn off Bluetooth, which seems like kind of a no-go. So I've heard some people saying that you shouldn't get this if you want to use the AirPods Max with an Android device. And I gotta say, I totally agree, but I don't think they did a great job of explaining why. And that to me is kind of a deal breaker. I think AirPods Pro, which I've also got, are perfectly fine with an Android device. AirPods Max, however, because of that, I would not recommend. So there is that. Like I mentioned, some of the device switching stuff that, the Apple magic wasn't quite as seamless here with the AirPods Max as I would like it to be. That much I can kind of forgive a little bit, but it's definitely worth calling out. But I did have a few, I think, bigger issues with the livability of the AirPods Max. So for one, using it here on a MacBook Air, and I had the same issue using it actually on my iMac, which I have off camera over here to the right. For some reason, there's just occasional Bluetooth blips and drops that I get on both of these Mac devices. Just listening to music, maybe it's because I'm listening to FLAC, I have no idea what's going on, but I do get occasional dips and drops in the audio listening on a Mac. I didn't have any issues here with the iPhone, and I don't think I had any issues with my iPad either. So it seems to be integrated better with iOS than it is with macOS. And then one other thing worth calling out, and this is a really curious one. I had the AirPods Max sitting on a table in my living room, and I took a phone call in a completely different room, and for some reason, even though if I played a song or played a YouTube video, it would have come out of my iPhone, for some reason, in that situation, it routed my call audio through the AirPods Max sitting on a table in a room completely separate from me. So that was a little annoying. There's controls on iPhone to get around it, and that seems like the sort of bug that they're gonna fix with firmware, which again, if you're using an Android device, you're not gonna get those firmware updates, but worth pointing out that some of the Apple Magic stuff, while I appreciate what they're doing here, and I think that Apple's doing things with AirPods, both AirPods Max and AirPods Pro, that I would like to see other Bluetooth device manufacturers go with. As much as I like that stuff, it's still definitely not perfect here on the AirPods Max. The one thing I will go ahead and call out though as I think really nice on the AirPods Max is the Bluetooth range. In fact, this is probably the best Bluetooth range of any Bluetooth headphone I've tried. I was able to have my MacBook sitting on a couch in the living room and pretty much walk all around the house, go into the garage, go into a room on the opposite side of the house, and was perfectly able to listen to my music, which is actually really pretty impressive. And yeah, I don't know. I think it almost makes this feel like a portable setup. I mean, it is a portable setup, but being attached to sort of a non-portable system like a laptop or even my desktop, being able to walk around the house as if it's portable, I thought was actually pretty cool. Active noise canceling, I'll talk a little bit about, but I'll be honest, I didn't do a whole lot of comparisons with the Sonys or the Bose. I mean, my general thought is that the active noise canceling on AirPods Max is about on par with the Sony and the Bose. You know, there's going to be some other YouTube channels that'll probably go into detail about which one is absolutely better in which situation. My take is that different headphones are going to do better with different frequencies. And they're all like good enough that I wouldn't make that the primary reason I personally would choose a headphone like this. So generally I'd say that they do noise canceling pretty well. The thing that I think AirPods Max does above and beyond most other Bluetooth noise canceling headphones, however, is that transparency mode. So I can throw these things on my head. Transparency mode activates and I can actually talk normally, like I can hear myself and it feels like I'm not wearing headphones. If I did that with a normal noise canceling headphone, well, if I just turn noise canceling on here, I'm probably gonna end up start talking louder than I should be. And I mean, a lot of other Bluetooth headphones with noise canceling will have something like a transparency mode. But if you haven't used Apple's transparency mode, I think you've probably had a bad experience. It's just my guess. You know, on the Sony XM3s, they've got like that feature where you can put your hand over your ear and you can briefly hear the outside. It's useful for sure, but I wouldn't like go about my life with that sort of transparency mode. The transparency here, you could turn it on and just walk around and almost forget that you're wearing headphones or you're wearing noise canceling headphones, because Apple does it really, really well. My one quibble with the transparency mode is I do think that high frequencies are a little bit over elevated, and that will kind of come into play when, you know, I mentioned that these ear pads are scratchy, right? And like, as I'm moving this thing around in my head, I feel like the scratchiness of those ear pads is being amplified a little bit too much. You know, things like even just like touching the ear cups of the AirPods Max, right? And that'll happen when I'm activating the controls. It's a little bit over amplified. And if Apple wanted to just dial it in and make it a little bit more perfect, I think those high frequencies could probably be tamed down a little bit, but it's getting fairly nitpicky. Generally, pretty impressed with that stuff. So I think we can just go ahead and now get into the nitty-gritty of the sound of this headphone. I did actually skip one thing. We'll get to that later though. Let's talk about the sound of the AirPods Max, which, like I said up front, I think this is a significantly better sounding headphone than the Sony XM3s and the Bose 700s. I've heard some other active noise canceling headphones, so from Beats, from Bang & Olufsen, I've heard some B&Ws. None of them, in my opinion, were frankly worth listening to music on. The AirPods Max, I actually think these are worth listening to music on. I don't think this is necessarily on the level of a $500 non-Bluetooth headphone, but if that's your expectation, I feel like you're kind of kidding yourself. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the sound of this headphone. I mean, some challenges that Bluetooth active noise canceling headphones typically have, right? So challenge number one, they're going for sort of a general consumer tune, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you're not going to get your reference level neutral audio. And that's fine. Challenge number two with these sorts of devices is you're dealing with a closed back headphone, and just generally closed back headphones don't sound as good as open back headphones. Now, obviously, for obvious reasons, there are some advantages to having a closed back headphone, but if you're just looking for pure sound quality, being closed back is a downside. And then finally, the third challenge that these headphones have is just being noise canceling, right? And there's just all kinds of audio trickery that they have to do inside of this ear cup that, an audiophile open back headphone doesn't have to deal with. That stuff, they're canceling out lows, but then they also need to deliver lows to you. And so I mean, I've never made one of these sorts of things. I imagine that is not easy, but I do have a feeling that that is a part of why most of these headphones do not sound good. The AirPods Max, surprisingly, I think, kind of overcome most of the, well, I don't want to say they overcome all those problems, but they definitely do a really good job, in my opinion, given those circumstances. So again, I don't think this is the best sounding headphone for 500 bucks, but I do think the AirPods Max, frankly, are competitive with non-Bluetooth, non-active noise canceling, closed back headphones that are about under $200. And if that sounds like too many caveats for you, I can understand. But just to set the stage, like, I think these things sound about as good as something like the AKG K371s, maybe like the Meze 99 Classics. They don't sound the same as those headphones. We'll get into a little bit more detail about the specifics, but I think just in terms of overall audio enjoyment and how much I enjoy listening to music, I would put these about on par with those other headphones. So let's get into talking about just the general sound signature of the AirPods Max. And I already talked about this a little bit in a previous video, but I'm actually pretty surprised with the tuning that Apple went with. This is not an especially safe tuning. In fact, this is kind of like a warm, downward sloping, bassy, almost like a U-shaped tuning that does some things pretty well, does some things a little bit confusing. But yeah, just generally, it's a fun tune, right? It's not a neutral audiophile tune, but like I mentioned before, like, that's not actually necessarily a thing that us audiophiles need. We don't need every headphone to have a neutral tune. The AirPods Max, definitely not neutral. There's a lot of bass emphasis here, and we'll get a little bit more into detail about the bass, but yeah, there's a lot of bass here. And I would say that same thing about like the Sonys and the Bose, and I would say that as a negative in regards to the Sonys and the Bose, but it's done much better here. The mid-range I find a little bit muted. Vocals are surprisingly kind of withdrawn. And then the treble is actually a little bit spicy on these things. Surprisingly spicy, I found, for a consumer headphone. So let's go into a little bit more detail about those different characteristics. So the bass, like I mentioned, I do think that this thing qualifies as a bassy headphone, but I think it's really actually pretty well done bass. The bass, you know, on something like the Sony XM3s, right? I describe that as too bassy and just kind of nasty sounding. It gets a little bit muddy, a little bit boomy, and just not that exciting. The bass, however, on the Apple AirPods Max, I think, is very exciting because it's actually pretty well isolated into the very, very low frequencies. The mid bass doesn't actually have a lot of emphasis. And so what that has the effect of is, depending on your music, it gives this a really fun, bassy, like tactile feel, but without having that mid bass that kind of blooms and smears up the rest of the mid range. I think it's actually pretty well defined. Maybe not necessarily especially strong in terms of discerning the different notes, the different tones in the bass, but I think that it is actually pretty well done here. Now the mid-range maybe is the most surprising part of the tune here of the AirPods Max because, well, most headphones, like there's this thing called ear gain, right? Where with sort of a flat sound signature, your ear is going to amplify certain frequencies, we'll call them in the upper mid-range, that will make it so that voices stand out a little bit more, vocals, right? Vocals in the song mix. The AirPods Max surprisingly don't really do that. In fact, the upper mid-range where you would expect that vocal forwardness is not here. And so the effect is that vocals are actually kind of withdrawn on the AirPods Max, actually pretty surprising. You could describe it as recessed. I don't think that that is an unfair description of the vocals on the AirPods Max. And it's not quite the same recession that you would get on a typical V-shaped headphone. And I think that's because, you know, the bass elevation and the treble elevation on this is pretty well isolated to the extremes of the frequency response, but definitely this is not a vocal forward headphone. And I think that it does lose out a little bit on detail there in the mid-range, just because of, well, maybe because of that tuning, but maybe because of other aspects of this headphone. And then we'll get into talking about the treble real quick, which that was the spicy bit that I talked about in sort of my hot take when I first started listening to the AirPods Max. The treble on this, so in like the lower and mid treble region, it's not too bad. But in the upper treble, sort of the extended frequencies, the AirPods Max are surprisingly elevated, which gives the sound signature kind of, I don't know, kind of almost like a tizzy, a little bit fatiguing of a sound. It's not quite the sort of like breathy, fatiguing sound that you might get on some other headphones with elevated treble. And in fact, some people, you know, if you're older, maybe you have some hearing damage, you might not actually detect the elevated treble that you get here because it is so high in the frequency response, but I'm able to hear it, and personally I find it a little bit irritating, frankly, with things like hi-hats, right? Hi-hats and cymbals in songs, or even like drum brushes. They can just become a little bit of an irritant, I find, when listening to music that has that stuff in it. So just some examples of some tracks. Sublime's Santeria, I think the hi-hats in that track were a little bit irritating. Fleetwood Mac's Gold Dust Woman, it's got this like drum brush kind of going on through it, and I found that, again, a little bit too spicy for my tastes here. It also has the effect, and so I'm, you know, been mostly talking about music, but I did also use these a lot listening to YouTube videos, because that's my primary reason why I would jump between different devices, is going from music to watching YouTube or something like that. And a lot of YouTube audio is not necessarily recorded professionally, and it might have some, this video you're watching is probably a good example of it. The high frequency stuff just can be a little bit irritating, I found, here on the AirPods Max, even with some stuff that I find is pretty well recorded, like MKBHD videos. I found the AirPods Max just make it just a little bit hot, and can be a little bit fatiguing because of that treble. Now, the plus side to having this kind of treble is that it does give the AirPods Max a pretty decent sense of air, which is not a thing that you can say about all headphones. In fact, I can't think of any other Bluetooth active noise canceling headphone that has any sense of air whatsoever. So that much I'll give to Apple. But I do still think that's the sort of thing that's a little bit spicy. I'm surprised they did it, and I do still kind of think that they should change it with the firmware update, assuming that sort of thing is possible. And frankly, I do think that sort of thing is possible. So now, I guess we can go ahead and talk a little bit more about the technical stuff of this, and I won't belabor this stuff too much. I don't think this is like an exceptionally well-performing technical headphone, but it does, I think, a really pretty surprisingly good job of soundstage and instrument separation, right? If you've heard something like the Sony XM3s or the Bose, and you think that sounds good, I'm happy for you, but they just don't do soundstage and sound separation almost at all. And that's one of the reasons I don't like listening to those headphones. Part of it I definitely blame on the elevated mid-bass that those headphones have, but there's probably other aspects to it. And the AirPods Max, I find, actually do that sort of separation and 3D-ness to the sound pretty well. I don't think it's, you know, on par with something like the Sennheiser HD 560S, which is a, you know, $200 open back headphone, but I think it does it pretty well. And frankly, I think that, you know, this does staging even a little bit better than something like the K371, the AKGs, which is a relatively well-known audiophile headphone. So I'll give them props for that. Just generally too, I think in terms of detail, these things aren't necessarily the strongest. I mean, I think they do that sort of macro contrast really, really well. And that's what makes this a really fun and exciting headphone. And I think it helps contribute to that 3D sense that you get here on the AirPods Max. But when it comes to sort of the micro contrast that you might get, you know, sort of the detail and the treble or the texture in vocals and stuff like that, the AirPods Max are a little bit weak on that front, in my opinion. And so that's kind of all I gotta say about the AirPods Max. I mean, I'll go ahead and give these things a score. And I think out of 5 stars, I'll give the AirPods Max 3 stars. I think these things are pretty well done, but there's one big problem that I have with these that I didn't really talk about. And it's the battery situation. So battery life on these things, 20 hours, that's not that bad. But the big problem that I have with these things is there's no power button on them. And there's been a lot of like confusion about whether or not this goofy case is necessary part of the AirPods experience. I actually I reviewed them without using this case because there's no way that if this is a necessary part of the experience, there's no way that I'm going to enjoy it. So I live with these things without the case. And the biggest downside is the battery on these things drains about 10 to 15% every day if I don't even use it, right? So if I just leave these things on a table, within a week, they'll be dead, which isn't the case with something like the AirPods Pro. These things I can leave sitting on a table. I can basically use these the way that I want to use the AirPods Max for about a month in between charges, whereas here with the AirPods Max, it's going to be about once a week, which I find actually kind of a big bummer. But it doesn't really answer the question of whether or not I think the AirPods Max are overpriced. And frankly, my answer to that question is, it really depends. If you have in your mind, if you're set on getting a noise-canceling Bluetooth headphone, I don't think this is actually overpriced, because I think if that's what you want, and 350 bucks for the Sony's is okay, I think it's worth 200 bucks extra to make it something that actually sounds listenable. And I think the AirPods Max are listenable. This is a fun music listening headphone. Not necessarily the most detailed, not the best sound you can get for 500 bucks, but for an active noise canceling Bluetooth headphone, I think it is the best sound that you can get. And I think for that, it's worth it. Again, the build quality, that stuff is great. Just my biggest problems with this headphone, frankly, are I do wish Apple would tone down the treble. There's still a chance they will with firmware, but I'm not gonna hold my breath. And I don't know, that battery situation I find is actually kind of a bummer. So that is the Apple AirPods Max. If you're interested in checking this thing out, of course, I've got a link in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you like this video, you found it helpful, please hit the like button. It helps me out. Subscribe to the channel, and if you want to be part of the next live stream, if you're not here with me live right now, go ahead and ding the bell so that YouTube will let you know when I'm live. And I'll see you on the next super review.